Hello and welcome everyone to your week 3's lecture on cardiovascular diseases. So we'll get started. So these are your following learning objectives. And these couple of slides are your pre-readings for this week's lecture. So please do skim through these slides. All right, so there are not many slides, but just a few. And then from here on, I'll take it forward. So basically, the first thing which I want to do in this lecture is to explain you the mechanism of arteriosclerosis, all right, which is a coronary heart disease. And the background of coronary heart disease is part of your pre-readings. So please do go through those. So as you have seen over here, I have refer to the Word document. In the Word document, I have laid down the mechanism of arteriosclerosis in a flow chart form. So I'll quickly just share it with you to show you how it looks. And this is available on your Canvas site, the Word document. All right, so this is just roughly to show you this is how it looks. And I'll be explaining this to you in the PowerPoint, but the details of which is present in the Word document. All right, so now I'll share the slides again. Just bear with me. All right, okay. So guys, over here, I have explained the mechanism of arteriosclerosis in a diagrammatic format. Okay, so you don't, if this is scaring you, as I said, don't worry. You have the entire content written well, properly typed in a Word document, and this will be available to you on Canvas. This is generally, I do have, say basically, I have a A4 size paper. And when I do these online lectures, when I do the face-to-face lectures, that is when I have, you have the OHP projector, the overhead projector on which I place the paper, and it is much more easier to understand. But yes, so basically I had to say, just take a screenshot of that paper and I had to copy paste it in the slide. So rest assured your quality of learning will not be impacted because the exact mechanism is available for you in the Word document. All right, so I'll get started. So what happens in arteriosclerosis? As you know, it happens in the coronary artery, which is the main artery that supplies blood to your heart. All right, so we are talking about arteriosclerosis, predominantly the coronary artery, the big artery that supplies blood to your heart. So the inner wall of the coronary artery, that is called as the endothelium. All right, and this endothelium, which is the inner lining of the coronary artery, that gets damaged. So the injury over here, which I have shown these abrasion signs, this is the coronary artery, the endothelium wall getting damaged. And how does it get damaged? It gets damaged because of, say, hypertension, because of, say, genetics, or it could be because of chronic sublime inflammation. And we have seen the damage which is caused by inflammation. We have spoken a lot about it in your obesity and in your diabetes lecture. All right, so yes, it could get damaged because of multiple reasons. The key ones which I have written over here are hypertension, genetics, inflammation. All right, so when you have abrasion on your endothelium wall, abrasion meaning like, you know, if you scratch your skin, it becomes red and sore. So basically something like that, but this is happening in the inner wall of your artery. All right, and what flows through the artery? You have blood which is flowing through the artery. All right, and blood carries a lot of nutrients. It also carries a lot of waste products to be given to the kidney, to be filtered, to be eliminated, etc. All right, so in the blood, what you have is your LDL cholesterol, you have your total cholesterol, and then you have dead cells. As I said, that things which the blood takes to various organs for filtration and excretion. All right, and then because it's an abrasion, you also have fibrin in the blood. So basically what happens in the abrased area, you have LDL cholesterol which is sticking, you have total cholesterol which is sticking, and on that you have dead cells which are sticking, and then you have a fiber mesh forming on it, which is fibrin. All right, so now this is called as a fatty streak. Fatty streak, basically it is not hard, it is soft. All right, because you don't have calcium deposition at this stage. This is a soft, say, the soft plaque is called as fatty streak. All right, so plaque is usually the term which is used when it is calcified, when it is hard, When plaque is not hard, that is when it is called as a fatty streak. All right. So basically these deposition, they decrease the diameter of the artery. That is called as thrombosis. Okay, decrease in the diameter of the artery or your blood vessels because of deposition. This is called as thrombosis. So then what happens? You have these fatty streaks which keep on increasing in size. All right, so this keeps on increasing in size and diameter keeps on decreasing. Okay, and then what happens? Then you have all this LDL and total cholesterol which is stuck over there. And of course, there is a great chances that this cholesterol will get oxidized. All right. So how will it get oxidized? Because of the oxygen molecules which are also floating in the blood. All right. So this cholesterol will react with the oxygen and this will start creating inflammatory responses. Okay. So oxidation of your fat molecules which are stuck in the fatty streak, this will create an inflammatory response. And as you have seen in the diabetes lecture, whenever you have inflammatory responses, okay, when you have oxidation of something happening, the first thing which happens is triggering of your immune system. Now you have this oxidized fat which is sitting over there. So your immune system will tell monocytes to go to the arteries and start eating these oxidized fat molecules. Okay. So monocyte will turn into macrophages because they start eating the oxidized LDL and cholesterol. Okay, so these are all your monocytes, the one which has two eyes, basically in my diagram. Okay, they start eating all of this oxidized fat. All right. So of course, you know, when monocytes start eating something, they are called as macrophages. Okay. So when monocytes keep eating these oxidized fat, they become bigger and bigger and larger. And then they are called as foam cells. Okay. So now these foam cells also get stuck to this layers of fatty streaks which are ongoing and which are forming. Okay. So it's like a loop. So you have fatty streak which is forming. Monocytes are trying to eat them, but there is more fatty streak forming. These monocytes have now turned into macrophages. They get stuck on this fatty streak. So this keeps becoming bigger and bigger. So now on this foam cells, you have calcium deposition taking place. This takes place over time. Okay. So imagine this process taking place over several number of years. Okay. So that's why this may look very quick, but this does not happen so instantly. All right. It takes several years for this to happen. All right. So when you have calcium deposition on these foam cells, that is when this fatty streak turns into plaque. Plaque meaning which is really hard. All right. The blockage, this is now really hard and that's why it's called as a plaque. All right. So now what happens? Now you have smooth muscle cells. Okay. SMC, which I have written over here. Smooth muscle cells. They travel from the inner wall of the artery and they start stucking on this plaque. Okay. And they start forming a fiber mesh sort of a thing. So the smooth muscle cells, they look really elongated, oval in shape. Okay. These ones are called as smooth muscle cells. You know how you had fibrin, which starts forming a mesh on the fatty streak. Similarly, you have the smooth muscle cells, which starts forming a fibrous mesh on this plaque. Okay. All of this in totality, what is it doing? It is decreasing the diameter of the artery. All right. And now this is a plaque. This is really, really hard. So imagine that the diameter is decreasing, but it is like putting in bricks. Okay. So it's so hard. All right. So yes, when you have the diameter decrease, what is going to happen? One point, it may so happen that there is 90% blockage. This is what you must have seen. You must have seen it, the medical professional doctors say that yes, there is a 90% blockage. So what does this mean? It means when there is just a 10% passageway remaining, this is called as a 90% blockage. All right. So what is happening? So basically all this plaque has taken a lot of space, and because there is such tiny pathway for the blood to travel from one end. So look at my mouse over here, from one end to the other end, because the plaque keeps increasing and there is very little blood which is traveling on the other side, what will happen? This will cause necrosis of that blood vessel. Okay, so if you remember necrosis, it means death of cell. Death of cell is happening because you do not have sufficient blood traveling over there, oxygen, nutrient traveling over there. So at the end, the blood vessel dies. Okay, and this then results in heart attack. All right, so myocardial infarction is when you have such a severe blockage that 90%, for example, that you have very, very limited amount of bloods and nutrients traveling to the other end. This is resulting in the death of that blood vessel. Over here, the blood vessel we are talking about is the coronary artery. All right. And on the other hand, what may happen is that you may have a piece of this plaque which breaks off. All right. And this is basically, this is what they call the blood clot. Okay. And then it keeps traveling in the blood and then gets stuck in some of these small little microcapillaries. We spoke a lot about microcapillaries in the diabetes lecture, if you remember, when we spoke about glycosylation of blood vessels, tiny blood vessels. Okay. So similarly over here in tiny blood vessels, you may have these blood clots which are stuck. Now these blood clots breaking and they sticking into these microcapillaries, this is called as embolism. All right. So then when this gets stuck in these tiny blood vessels, the same thing is going to happen. When you have a big blood clot which is stuck in a tiny blood vessels, you won't be having blood flowing on the other end, no oxygen, no nutrient transportation on the other end, necrosis of the cell. And then what will happen? Then depending upon where this blood clot is, it may result in a stroke, meaning, for example, if it happens in the brain, all right, or it may burst the blood vessel because the blood clot is so big and the blood is pressurizing. It's trying to go on the other end, and these microcapillaries are so delicate, they are like thinner than your hair as well. All right, so they are so thin and delicate that they may burst. All right, so you may have different types of hemorrhages. Okay, so and if it happens, say in your feet, that is when you have deep vein thrombosis. Okay, so depending upon which area of your body this blood clot is happening, the outcome will be different, and we'll be looking at the different outcome in one of these slides. All right. So hopefully, guys, this gives you a good idea. So this diagram just in itself looks overwhelming, but I have taken you slowly and surely throughout the entire process, so you know what it means. Basically, as I said, that I like learning pathophysiological mechanisms through diagrams because it helps you to remember long term. So this is my diagrammatic representation, but rest assured, you have a proper written Word document for the same. All right. So now moving further. So in this lecture, we are going to discuss two main risk factors of cardiovascular diseases. Okay, so first one is metabolic syndrome and the second one is hypertension. All right, so we'll start with metabolic syndrome, MS. Metabolic syndrome, over here I have just abbreviated it as MS. So what is metabolic syndrome? Metabolic syndrome is a cluster of risk factors. So basically metabolic syndrome is like a bunch of diseases happening together. Okay, so if I had to say it in layman terms, which makes it easier for you to understand. So basically what are these bunch of diseases that are happening together? Is excessive abdominal weight, meaning the individual is obese, the individual has some sort of cardiovascular diseases, specifically lipid abnormalities. The second type of cardiovascular diseases, the individual also has hypertension and the individual also has diabetes, meaning elevated blood glucose levels. All right, so if you see, this is a cluster of diseases. You have obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, when these three major chronic health disorders, which is your lecture 1, 2, and 3, when they happen together, this is called as metabolic syndrome. Okay, so can metabolic syndrome be prevented? As I said, metabolic syndrome is not a disease in itself, it's a syndrome. Okay, it's a cluster of diseases. As long as you can manage and address these underlying conditions, then yes, it can be prevented, yes, it can be managed, depending upon what the condition is and at what stage the individual is. All right, so I hope this gives you a good idea about metabolic syndrome. All right, so now moving forward is the diagnosis of metabolic syndrome. So if you have at least 3 of these 5 factors present, then yes, the individual is diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. So the first one is elevated waist circumference. All right. So as you know, in lecture 1 in obesity, I had shown you what the waist circumference cutoffs are. All right. So if they are higher than the recommended cutoffs, then yes, that is one diagnostic factor. Second is elevated triglycerides level. Third, reduced HDL level, which is your good cholesterol. Elevated blood pressure. and elevated fasting glucose. Okay, so if you have 3 of these 5 factors, then yes, the individual is likely to have metabolic syndrome. Okay, so now moving further is hypertension. So now with hypertension, as you all know, you have 2 main types of hypertension classification, which is systolic and diastolic. All right. So systolic is when the heart is making a big effort, when it pumps the blood through the aorta, and through that the blood is going all over in the body. Okay, so that's the high blood pressure. Diastolic is when the heart is filled up, the ventricles of the heart, they are filled up with the blood which has been pumped from the lungs coming into the heart. Okay, so that's your low blood pressure. All right, so that's like your high blood pressure, low blood pressure. All right, so in your pre-readings you have the blood pressure cutoffs. Okay, so because that's just as it is, it's not rocket science, so I have kept it in your pre-reading, so I can take all the time of your lecture to go through the different mechanisms, so it's easier for you. This is more complicated, so I should spend my time on explaining these complicated things to you. So don't worry, the cutoffs for your blood pressure, the what is high blood pressure, hypertension, all of those cutoffs are mentioned in your pre-reading slides. And as you can see, high blood pressure greater than the 140 to 90. And if you have normal blood pressure, it is less, which is 80 to 120. Okay, or 120 to 80. Less than 120 to 80, that's your normal one. Your high one is greater than 140 to 90, but this all is part of your pre-readings. All right. So now moving through the physiological process of how the body increases your blood pressure. Okay, so guys, remember, anybody who has low blood pressure, sometimes you know how individual don't drink water throughout the day because of XYZ reason, and then they may start showing symptoms of low blood pressure, which is like headache, dizziness, and nausea and things. So this renin-angiotensin mechanism happens for anybody who is experiencing low blood pressure. Okay, so this is a normal healthy mechanism which happens for anybody. This becomes a problem when the renin-angiotensin mechanism is going on in a loop. All right, and when does it go on in a loop? We'll come to one of the reasons, dietary reasons for those. Okay, so now as I said, when an individual has low blood pressure, what happens? So this is kidney. Okay, so everything, as I said, I do a lot of diagrams and shorthand. So this kidney shaped thing is kidney. All right, so what does the kidney do? The kidney releases renin. Okay, and renin, what renin does is that it goes to the liver. This triangle over here, this is, so look at my mouse. So this over here is your liver. Okay, now your liver releases angiotensin. Okay, so what does renin do? Renin converts the angiotensin to angiotensin 1. Okay, it helps in the conversion of angiotensin to angiotensin 1. All right, so yes, these are all protein molecules. All right, so basically then you have angiotensin 1. It goes to your lungs. So these double triangles, they are lungs. Okay, so now what happens in the lungs? You have angiotensin 1, which is converted to angiotensin 2 with the help of enzyme which is called as angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. Okay, so yes, you have angiotensin 1 converted to angiotensin 2 with the help of angiotensin converting enzyme. Now this angiotensin 2 goes back to your kidney. We started from the kidney, we end in the kidney. Okay, kidneys are very, very important for your blood pressure regulation. Okay, so you may think only heart, but no, kidneys as well. All right, so yes, now your angiotensin 2 goes back into the kidney. What does angiotensin 2 do? It activates the hormone aldosterone. All right, and aldosterone has two functions. It does two things. Aldosterone causes vasoconstriction of your blood vessels, meaning it makes your blood vessels narrower, because logically speaking, the blood pressure is low. All right, if you make it narrow, it will help to increase the blood pressure because the surface area increases. Okay, so imagine the surface area is this much. So yes, it's like the blood level will be low, just like logically, like, you know, as a layman term. Then if you have vasoconstriction, the same blood level will be high. It's like a broad glass versus a narrow glass. All right, So yes, so you have vasoconstriction of your blood vessels. And on the other hand, what aldosterone does is that it retains water, okay, because it wants to increase the blood pressure. But when it retains water, what also happens is automatically what happens is that you also retain sodium, all right? And sodium and potassium are opposite in nature. When sodium is retained, potassium will be automatically excreted, all right, through your urine, all right? So there is retention of water and sodium, and this net effect increases your blood volume, which increases your blood pressure, okay? So yes, this is a normal healthy mechanism. Any one of us who's experiencing a low blood pressure, this mechanism is going to happen, all right? So I hope this mechanism is simple and very clear. I can assure you that the mechanisms for this lecture, cardiovascular disease, they are pretty simple and straightforward. So you won't have trouble, hopefully, okay? All right, so then you have types of hypertension. So you have primary hypertension, which is say accounts for 90 to 95% of diagnosed cases. Now this primary hypertension is basically it is not because of any specific say medical reason as such. Predominantly it is because of genetic predisposition. It could be because of age. It could be because of say certain ethnic backgrounds. So basically, you can't really do something about the primary hypertension. Like, you know, it is not a very easily modifiable factor, is what I'm saying. All right. Then you have secondary hypertension. Secondary hypertension could be because of an underlying secondary medical condition, such as you have, say, when you, as I said, like, you know, it's not just your heart, which is important for your cardiac health. Your blood pressure is also predominantly regulated by your kidneys. And you see, before it comes to the kidney, you have so many other organs playing a role. You also have a role of your lungs, and you have a role of your liver. So any of these systems which are organelle systems which are not working well, meaning you could have issues of hypertension. In the lecture of diabetes, we studied how diabetic individuals may be at risk of hypertension. So connect all of those dots. All right. Then yes, there are certain medications in which you have a side effect where you may have hypertension, or in hyperparathyroidism, you may also see indicators of hypertension. So yes, basically secondary medical conditions can cause hypertension, and this accounts for 5 to 10% of cases. So there are not all hypertensive cases have the same thing, which is, oh, because you were eating so much of salt in your life, you got hypertension. No, regulating your salt in your diet, or sodium particularly, which is the main factor in your diet for hypertension, is a management strategy. Okay, so basically it is not a key determinant of it. There are underlying major key determinants in research, but yes, managing sodium in your diet once an individual is diagnosed of hypertension, then yes, it's a management strategy. All right, and how is it a management strategy? We'll come to that. All right, so this is just an FYI, as I showed you in the atherosclerosis, the diagram, that if you have hypertension, all right, and if you have a clot or a rupture, depending upon which part of the body the clot or the rupture is happening, you may have various conditions. So in the heart, you may have a heart attack, or CCF, congestive cardiac failure, or else hypertension, all right. Brain, stroke, kidney, you can have impairment of kidney, all right. It could be say acute or chronic. With eyes, you can have vision impairment, you can have those blood spots. You know how I told you the glycosylations of blood vessels for the eyes. Similar concept is also applied for blood pressure. All right, then peripheral arteries and veins, you could have paralysis. Then in the legs, when you have your veins in the legs, which may have this issue, you could have deep vein thrombosis. And the minor symptoms could also be your varicose veins. Okay, so many reasons, all right, or many consequences of high blood pressure, all right, or hypertension. All right, so guys, this is a very simple mechanism. This is very similar to the atherosclerosis mechanism, that when you have high blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure is what we are talking about, okay, constant for number of years, the individual's general blood pressure readings are on the higher scale, on the higher end. Okay, so remember, these chronic conditions, they are called as chronic because they don't happen overnight. All right, so it is not like coronavirus, where you touch someone today and then tomorrow you have coronavirus. Okay, so it's not like that. all right? It takes several number of years. All right, so when you have high blood pressure, what happens? Yes, you have blood which is flowing through your small blood vessels with very high pressure. Okay, it is just like the simple thing which I teach you in grade school is when you have a hose pipe, and then if you are like, going to say cover part of the hose pipe, then you have water which is flowing through a lot of pressure. So imagine that pressure in your delicate little blood vessels. Okay, so it's not that level of pressure, but you can get the idea. All right. So yes, you have this excessive pressure which causes injury to the blood vessel. And the same thing happens. You have the fatty streak, and your fatty streak, and then you have an inflammatory response, then you have a plaque development. With plaque, you have clot formation, the embolism, which we talked about, all right? And this can cause a clot, all right? Or this can cause a rupture, okay? And then depending upon whether it's a clot or a rupture and where it is, your different organelle systems will be affected, all right? So yep, I hope it makes sense. It's the mechanisms of this lecture are very, very simple and straightforward. So as I said, hypertension prevention, okay, and management strategy is where you look at managing your sodium intake, all right? So basically, as I said, that because you had high salt in your diet, you got hypertension. That is not very common. As common hypertension is because of secondary underlying medical condition, all right? And the best thing about regulating sodium is for individual who are hypertensive patients is sodium regulation. Why? We will come to the mechanism why, all right? So if you see your 1 teaspoon of salt, just one normal teaspoon of salt, that is 2,300 milligram of sodium, which is the upper limit of how much you should be having, okay, in a day. All right, so you just add 1 teaspoon of salt and something, and that's it. You can't have any more sodium, and you have a lot of hidden sodium. You have milk which is high in sodium, okay? You have your pulses and lentils also which have sodium. Okay, so basically, yes, you have a lot of hidden sodium, but imagine 1 teaspoon and that's your upper limit. You haven't even accounted for the hidden sodium. So basically, that's why they say keep moderating your salt intake, all right? But yes, majority of your sodium is found more in processed foods, okay? Because you added a lot as a preservative as well. Okay, so yes, your kidneys, as I said, they are very, very important. They are required to maintain a osmotic balance within sodium and potassium. The problem happens, sodium as a cause of hypertension, very rare, okay? But chronic high intake of sodium as a cause of hypertension, plausible, okay? And the mechanism is explained over here. So I have written the mechanism over here in a very, it's a very brief, in a very brief manner, but I thought it would be best for me to explain to you the actual mechanism as well as to how chronic intake of sodium over a prolonged period of time. And we are not talking about only salt. Please remember, this is chronic intake of sodium, which can be which can result in hypertension. Okay, but as I said, the predominant causes, please remember, could be secondary under medical conditions. Why am I saying this? Because as practicing dietitians, when you have a hypertensive patient, it is very important to consider not just the sodium intake in his diet. Yes, that is going to be important because it's going to be an important management strategy for you to regulate their sodium intake. But you have to look at the underlying medical conditions, okay? And that will help you to tailorize the plan better. What if they have a kidney condition? Then just a low salt diet will not do, because with kidney condition comes the restriction or the management or regulation of phosphorus, potassium, and many other electrolytes. Okay, so that's why it's important to look at the patient holistically. All right, so yes, what happens over here is that, for instance, when an individual eats a lot of sodium, now let's think about processed foods. Okay, so when you're eating a lot of sodium, so yes, these are electrolytes, they don't need insulin, all right, for their absorption. So you have all these electrolytes now in your blood. Okay, so you have a lot of sodium in your blood, all right. So now this is what in old age terms our grandmas used to say, you have a thick blood, meaning you have high blood pressure. All right, so that thick blood is is indicating high solute concentration in your blood, which is sodium, okay, because you have eaten so much amount of, say, chips and crisp and all those things, biscuits and confectionery items. So now you have a lot of sodium in your blood, okay. So few of the students who were, say, from medical sciences and are not really nutrition, they asked, how is cake and all? Soda bicarb. Okay, so soda bicarb is one of the biggest thing you add in cakes. All right, so that in the food science reaction, soda bicarb helps you to release that carbon dioxide. When carbon dioxide is released from the cakes and those pastries, that is what gives those little porous, holy structures in your cake. And that is what makes it nice and soft, okay, apart from the eggs and butter and stuff like that. So yes, soda bicarb is nothing but sodium bicarbonate, which is sodium. All right. So yes, your cakes and pastries, this is how they have sodium. Okay, so yes, now because you have a lot of sodium in your blood, the water is drawn from your cells. Okay, so this, imagine this, you having a lot of chips and crisps, but you're not having enough amount of water. Okay, so now what happens is the water is drawn from your cells into the blood vessels. Okay, so yes, your cells now are getting dehydrated gradually, and all that water from the cell is going into your main bloodstream. All right, so yes, this is increasing your blood volume. Why? Because you want to have a osmotic balance. You can't have so much amount of solute and less amount of fluid concentration. It needs to have an osmotic balance. So yes, the first thing which happens is drawing water from the cell. So you have a water and you have a solute and solvent balance, which is your solute being your sodium and your solvent being your water. Okay, so yes, this increases your blood volume. All right, and now imagine the blood vessels can only expand and contract so much. Okay, so it's like a rubber band. If you're going to stretch it so much, at one point it's going to break. Okay, so yes, your blood vessels will expand only so much, but not more than that. And then what will happen? You will have an increased blood pressure. Okay, because of the increased blood volume, and this will lead to high blood pressure. Okay, so basically, yes, this is the first thing which happens, that your blood volume increases, but there is only so much capacity for your blood vessels to expand. All right, and therefore what results is increased blood pressure, because the surface area can only increase up to so much. All right, the diameter of your blood vessels. Now what is happening? The second thing which follows is that, yes, we know we have eaten a lot of sodium, chips and crisp and whatnot. All right, so yes, you have water which is drawn into your blood vessels. Okay, so yes, but remember, you cannot kill your cells. Okay, so you can only draw so much water from your cells into your blood vessels. Okay, so yes, you cannot dehydrate your cells. You cannot kill your cells, meaning you cannot dehydrate your cell. So then the body will register that, hang on, that's it. This is only so much water that I can draw from my cell, from the body cells. This individual's diet is just like this. This individual's diet is just eating a lot of processed food day in and day out for so many years. I have to start activating the other mechanism side by side. Okay, so once there is, say, only so much water that you can draw from your cell, then automatically the renin-angiotensin mechanism will start. Okay, the renin-angiotensin mechanism starts. You would say, contradict and say that, hang on, renin-angiotensin mechanism starts when there is low blood pressure. There is no issue of low blood pressure over here. But remember, in the renin-angiotensin mechanism, what does the aldosterone do? There are two functions: vasoconstriction, which is not what we want, but oh well, it's not take one, leave one. Okay, everything is going to happen in the body simultaneously, meaning yes, you will have vasoconstriction. Your aldosterone will not be like, oh, okay, this is because she's having so much of salt, let me not vasoconstrict and I'll just retain water and not throw it out in the urine. No, if aldosterone is activated, both the things will happen, meaning you will have vasoconstriction, which will automatically increase your blood pressure. You will have retention of water, which is what we ideally wanted. Why? Because there is a lot of solute in your blood. Okay, sodium. So we want a solvent. Your solvent is your fluid, your water. So this water retention is a good thing. But with this good thing, a lot of other things are happening which we don't want, but you can't choose one. Okay, so yes, you will have retention of water, which is going to increase the solvent concentration, but you will also have retention of sodium, which is what aldosterone does. Okay, automatically. organically. That's how it functions. So now that you have retention of not only water, but also sodium, all right? Now this sodium will further activate the renin-angiotensin mechanism, and this will keep running in a loop. Does that make sense? So this mechanism running in a loop chronically over a prolonged period of time results in chronic hypertension, okay? And that is when management of hypertensive patient with regulation, moderation of sodium in their diet is so very important, okay? So we can break this cycle at the end, all right? So the one way of preventing, say, a lot of sodium in your blood is manage your dietary intake, okay? Of course, if your kidneys are not working well, then it is not just about managing dietary intake, but it is also about looking at the secondary medical condition. But as you have seen with kidney management, although this is not an medical nutritional therapy subject, I had indicated to you, the first thing which you do in say a kidney disorder is you will be restricting the dietary intake of potassium, phosphorus, sodium, all of those things, okay? But now I hope it makes sense to you why. Because imagine kidney is not functioning, and that's why you will restrict sodium. Your diet is high in sodium and this is causing hypertension, you will restrict sodium over there. So many reasons as to why you may restrict an individual sodium intake suffering from hypertension, or hypertension because of any other underlying medical condition. Okay, so yes, guys, I hope this mechanism has been very clear for you. Again, very straightforward, or maybe because, yeah, I just know it so well now after so many years of studying nutrition that I find it very simple. But yes, just go through them, go through these video recordings whenever you're in doubt, and you will be fine. Okay, so rather than reading research articles, which may not make a lot of sense to you at this stage, it's good to go through something which is diagrammatic and someone talking through these diagrams. Okay, so now we'll move further. So what has shown the maximum effect in managing your blood pressure, high blood pressure? Weight reduction. Okay, weight reduction has shown to have the maximum effect. It reduces blood pressure by 5 to 20 mmHg, which is so good, per 10 kg weight reduction. All right, so which is great. So the best thing is, and as you may appreciate, and as we have discussed in the obesity lecture and diabetes lecture, that yes, when you have weight reduction, you definitely will have a reduction in blood pressure as well. All right. So yes, if the individual is suffering from hypertension. All right. So yes, the best thing which has shown to address lifestyle modifications for managing hypertension is your weight reduction. Then you have your DASH diet. We'll go through the very basics of DASH diet in the coming slides. Dietary sodium restriction. And now you know why, because I have explained to you the mechanism in the last slide. You have physical activity, aerobic physical activity, and you have moderate alcohol consumption. Okay, so all of these have shown to have the best effects, lifestyle modification effects for managing and addressing hypertension. All right, so now guys, this is the very basics of a DASH diet. So the nutrients and foods which are advised to be restricted in a DASH diet, obviously firstly is sodium. All right, so where you can, as I told you, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So definitely sodium restriction, which is less than 2,300 milligram. And remember, you have to even account for the invisible sodium. Okay, the examples which I gave you. Then saturated fat is no more than 6% of your caloric intake, and total fat no more than 27% of your caloric intake. Okay, and the emphasis predominantly is on, say, skim milk sort of products, which is no fat product or low fat product. Okay, now this goes for all your dairy fats. Okay, so when you have skim milk, that is what is preferred over whole milk. Okay, full cream milk. Then you have the emphasis is more on lean proteins, less than 18% of total calories coming from lean proteins, and greater emphasis is on vegan sources of protein, like you have your nuts, seeds, legumes, all of that. And with animal proteins, it has to be lean and predominantly fish and white protein in comparison to, say, red proteins. Okay, so if you see the examples I have given over here, fish, skinless poultry, soy products are your vegan products. Okay, so yes, so animal proteins in this sense, soy should be written on this side, so my bad guys. Okay, so soy is not an animal product. All right, but yes, within animal products, lean is the emphasis. Within animal products, the emphasis is on fish and your white meat, which is like your poultry, okay, skinless poultry. All right, then you have carbohydrates less than 55% of calories and 150 no more than 150 milligram of dietary cholesterol. Okay, and the focus is more on MUFA. Your monounsaturated oils will be looking at fats very soon. Your whole grains, which are rich in fiber. So basically, that is the emphasis over here. Why whole grains? Because fiber directly it has shown again to have good response with hypertension, with cardiovascular diseases. Why we will be, I'll be explaining you the reasons soon. Okay, and choosing fresh fruits and veggies again because of its antioxidants property, vitamin content, okay, fiber, soluble fiber content. All right, then you have your vegan protein, which I said, and as I said, dietary fiber, at least 30 grams is what is recommended. Okay, so that's your basics of the DASH diet. So now guys, we'll go through the dietary prevention and management guidelines. So basically it is if an individual is at risk of coronary heart disease or already has coronary heart disease, then becomes management, or at risk is when you are advocating lifestyle prevention strategies for chronic conditions such as coronary heart disease. Okay, so yes, basically the guidelines, they talk about, say, level of evidence. So this is just a rough idea to show you that wherever you have number 1 written, meaning that's the top most very, very strong evidence. Okay, then gradually it becomes weaker. So number 1 evidence, this is not an epidemiology unit, so I won't go into details of this. But basically number 1 evidence is very strong evidence around it. Okay, around the recommendation. So yes, now you have your types of fats. So where you have saturated fats, within saturated fats, you have 3 types of fat. You have your animal fats, which are your long chain saturated fatty acids. Okay. Now guys, very important over here to remember that within animal fats, and this is what I briefly covered in the diabetes lecture as well, which is you have your odd chain saturated fatty acids, meaning your long fatty acids, and you have your even chain saturated fatty acids. Okay. So now when we talk about your odd chain saturated fatty acids, they talk more about dairy fats. Okay, so fat which is there in the dairy, which has shown, recent evidence has shown that it has a heart protective effect. Whereas the even chain saturated fatty acids, which come more from animal sources of fat like red meat and all, and with poultry with skin and all of those things. So animal fat, even chain saturated fatty acids, they have shown to not be very much heart protective. Okay, so again, this is just a revision for you. So yes, within these saturated fats, the one which we should be most concerned about, and which we are in day-to-day life, is your long chain saturated fatty acids. Okay, so with your medium chain saturated fatty acids, like you have your coconut oil, for instance. Palm oil now is in a very big debate, of course, because of our lovely orangutans. Even I don't want them to be harmed. Okay, but yes, you do have an option, coconut oil. Okay, so yes, one of the most popular medium chain fatty acids in our diet is coconut oil, and it has definitely shown a lot of say health benefits. So say for instance, one of the big research area with the medium chain saturated fatty acid coconut oil is to do with, because it does not require like chylomicron for its absorption. So it has to do a lot with your enteral feeds, parenteral feeds. Now, what are enteral parenteral feeds? I'll briefly touch base on them when I cover one of your lectures in the future. Okay, but basically when you have any sort of GI condition, which is impairing digestion and absorption of fats, that is where you have medium chain triglycerides, your saturated fatty acids, they come into the picture, and they have shown really good results. Okay. So yes, previously it was very, very early, like the dietary practices in India, where that, oh, if you have any GI sort of conditions, if you cannot say digest, say your oils, okay, which do require chylomicrons for absorption, go on to animal fats such as ghee, clarified butter. But that's not the best option, because having excessive amount of ghee, meaning excessive amount of long chain saturated fatty acids, an excessive amount of that can definitely have its toll on cardiovascular diseases, right? So the next best option to this was your medium chain saturated fatty acid, which is your coconut palm oil. Okay. So now guys, remember, only animals have liver. Okay. Anything which has liver will have cholesterol. So obviously your coconut oil will not have cholesterol. Okay. It comes from a plant and plant don't have liver. All right. So your medium chain saturated fatty acids will not have cholesterol. Okay. So even though it is termed saturated fats, okay, it is not cholesterol. Your cholesterol issue is to do with long chain saturated fatty acids, all of your animal fats, be it your dairy fats or your meat fats. Okay. Then you have your short chain saturated fatty acids. So basically, humans, they have the potential of, say, producing short chain saturated fatty acids. When does this happen? When you have fibers, especially when you have your insoluble fibers, when they are fermented by the bacteria in your large intestine, this fermentation process of these insoluble fibers, this results in the production of short chain saturated fatty acids such as butyric acid. Okay, one of the most common ones. Even when you have resistant starch, now resistant starch is more of a food science concept, just like how you may have learned dextrinization, caramelization. If you're not familiar with these terms, please guys, you will have to look food science things up. And the one which I'm talking about, if you don't want to look up all of these concepts, just look at resistant starch. Okay. So look at resistant starch, look at a few research papers, look at a few textbooks, and it will tell you what exactly resistant starch is. All right. So basically, when you eat resistant starch or you eat fibers as such, so yes, this is fermented in the large intestine, fermentation process. It produces butyric acid, and butyric acid, it helps in the management of your blood lipid levels. It takes the bad cholesterol and it throws it out of the body in your poop, for example, okay, because it's in the large intestine. All right. So it has the capacity of binding to your say excessive dietary fats. It has the capacity of binding to LDL cholesterol, throwing it out of the body, and it helps to increase your HDL level. All right. So yes, again, you see saturated fats, short chain saturated fatty acids, they are actually good for you. All right. So all saturated fats are not bad. Okay. And now you know why. All right. Okay. So second, you have your mono unsaturated fatty acids, your MUFAs. Okay. So where you have mono unsaturated, meaning there is only one bond. Okay. So polyunsaturated, where you have many double bonds. Over here, you have a single double bond. Okay. So mono unsaturated fatty acids, you have, say, your plant based. Again, this is all plant based. MUFAs and PUFAs are all plant based. Okay. Yes, of course, there are some exceptions, and I'll tell you where. But yes, your MUFAs, for example, they come from your plants, such as your nuts, your olive oil, your avocado, canola oil, all of that is your MUFA. All right. And then you have your PUFA. Within your PUFA, you have two types of fatty acids, which you cannot produce in the body. Humans cannot produce it. And therefore, they need a supply of it from the diet. These are called as your essential fatty acids. Okay, sorry, I keep twisting and turning. It's because it's a long lecture and it's tiring to just sit. I like giving lectures face to face in a lecture room because you can stand, you can walk, and you can give a lecture. But anyways, now you know why I keep twisting and turning. All right. So now with your essential fatty acids, okay, so they are omega-3 and omega-6. So your omega-3 is called as alpha linolenic acid, okay, and your omega-6 is called as linoleic acid. Yes, you need to remember the terms, all right. So I always say that omega-3, so 3 is a smaller number, 6 is a bigger number, but 3 is a smaller number, but it has a very big name, linolenic. Whereas 6 is a bigger number, but it has a smaller name. Linoleic, it finishes like, it's like a half of a name. All right. So I don't know. That's how I remembered it as a student. If it helps. Okay. So yes, what are the sources of omega-3? You have your animal sources, which is your fish, your fatty fish, such as salmon and tuna. Okay. Which the type of fats you have over there in the animal fish, in the fish, they are your eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, EPA and DHA. And we'll be talking more about your EPA and DHA in the mental health lecture. Okay, and your plant sources are the original alpha linolenic acid, and which is called as your omega-3. They are from your vegan sources such as flaxseed, walnut, so on and so forth. Your linoleic acid, your omega-6, is something which is most commonly consumed in Western diet, all right, which is coming in form of say sunflower oil, soybean oil, safflower oil, all of those, okay, which is used a lot. These oils are say soybean oil, for example, that is used a lot in making of your confectionery item for frying, so on and so forth, and that's why it's so easily consumed. Large proportions of omega-6 are easily consumed in the diet, whereas the challenge is to meet adequate amount of omega-3 in your diet. But we'll be talking about both of these omega-6 and omega-3 essential fats more in your mental health lecture. Okay, so how much of saturated fat is recommended? No more than, which is say less than 7% of your total energy intake. Okay, so that much is recommended. All right, so and the other important thing for saturated fat, which is shown as, see, this is called level 3 evidence, whereas see, this one is a level 1 evidence, meaning very, very strong evidence. So what is the very, very strong evidence? It says that when you are consuming say less than 7% of total energy, total caloric intake as saturated fat, then yes, it has shown to decrease your LDL cholesterol levels, which is your bad cholesterol levels. Okay, so yes, that is the big finding. So if you're restricting your diet in saturated fats to no more than less than 7% of your total energy intake, there's level 1 evidence that this will decrease your bad cholesterol levels, LDL. All right. Whereas, yes, there is evidence which is showing that saturated fat intake could be associated with coronary heart disease. All right. Increase in saturated fat, increase in total cholesterol, increase in LDL cholesterol. So they are directly proportional to each other. All right. And there is a dose dependent relationship, meaning every 1% energy intake from saturated fat, meaning every 2% increase in serum LDL cholesterol level. Very scary. All right. So yes, what is the recommendation? Replace your saturated fats. This is particularly talking about animal fats, guys. All right. And within the animal fats, your long chain saturated fatty acids, as I said, we are more concerned in recent research regarding the even chain, long chain saturated fatty acids, which is coming from your say meat products. All right. Not that you can have in, as much amount of full cream milk you want. No, that is not ever advisable. Everything in moderation is important, and you will learn more about this if you were to learn medical nutritional therapy as dietitians. Okay, so yes, over here the recommendation is that saturated fat, which is your animal fat, replace it with your omega-6. All right. Okay, so moving further. So basically what is shown is that you replace 5% of saturated fat with PUFA, and this is the total cholesterol which decreases. Okay, 0.39 millimoles per liter. All right. So basically, this is just showing you the ratio of it. So if you replace 5% of your saturated fatty intake with PUFA in your diet, it decreases cholesterol by so and so number. Okay, yeah, sorry, those are my mom and my aunt in the background. Okay. So yeah, don't mind them. All right, because I have glasses behind me, that's why. Okay, so then you have hydrogenated fat, which is your trans fat. Okay, so basically, guys, you may have learned it in food science, and this is again part of food science, very difficult to cover in this unit. But if you look at the hydrogenation process, so yes, you have some amount of trans fat, which is naturally present in food, such as you may have heard a lot in dairy products, but that is minimal amount, okay? So naturally occurring trans fat is highly unlikely to cause any of the disease condition that we are talking about. It is trans fat which we are making in the food labs. Okay, so when you take, say, for example, liquid oil, all right, when you take plant-based oil and you hydrogenate it, you add, say, hydrogen bonds in it, and this happens at a very, very high temperature, and you convert the liquid fat, which is, say, oil, into, say, a solid looking substance, that is when all of the problem happens. All right. So for example, margarine is an example of this. Okay. Liquid fat converted into this. That is when hydrogenation happened. And this was more of a problem, say in the early 70s, 60s, okay, where the hydrogenation processes were not sophisticated enough. All right. So yes, you have what is recommended is that the trans fat level should be less than 1% of total energy. Okay. No more than that. All right. And trans fat intake has been associated with heart attack, myocardial infarction, coronary heart disease risk, increase in LDL and decrease in HDL, all the things that we don't want. Okay. And yes, what has been shown, you replace your trans fat, saturated fat with your MUFAs and your PUFAs. Okay. So, which is ideal. And that will give you level 1 evidence. Okay. So that's a level 1 evidence. All right. So basically, that is what trans fat is. So yes, the questions which I generally get from students is that, oh, okay, so now we have these olive oil butters and all, but remember the hydrogenation process is not as before. And now the food industries, they always clearly mention what the trans fat levels are at the in the nutrition labeling panel. Okay, for you to see if there are sufficient amount of trans fat for you to be worried about. Majority of the food products, because there is so much of nutrition awareness and knowledge, they don't have those levels of trans fat, but they are almost always mentioned. Okay, at least in the Australian food industries. Okay, so yes, so that is about trans fat. And why am I still advocating, say, plant-based butter over, say, the normal animal fat butter, is because of phytosterols. And why phytosterols, will come to that very soon. Okay, so now moving forward is your polyunsaturated fat. So as I said, your PUFAs, your omega-6, generally it is 8 to 10% of total energy intake which is consumed, and your EPA and DHA is, say, 500 milligram per day, which is your eicosapentaenoic and docosahexaenoic acid. Okay, that is your, say, animal form of omega-3, which comes from your salmon and your tuna, okay, or fatty fish. All right. And if you are consuming the vegan form of omega-3, which is like your specifically alpha linolenic acid, so then that has to be at least 2 grams per day. Okay. That is your walnut, flaxseed, all of those vegan forms. So what is the level of evidence over here? You have omega-6, it lowers LDL cholesterol, yes. But what is over here, the main concerning thing is when you do not have the right balance of omega-6 to omega-3. Okay, so when you have excessive amount of omega-6 in your diet and you do not have the sufficient amount of omega-3 in your diet, this can result in problems. And we are talking more about this in your mental health lecture. All right. So yes, so basically what else has been shown is that omega-3, which is, say, by supplementation, for instance, it decreases your triglyceride levels and it increases your HDL level, which is great. And omega-3 has a big role as an anti-inflammatory agent. And we are talking more about this in your mental health lecture. Everything I'm saying mental health lecture, but trust me, it will be worth it. Okay, so there is a lot of this covered in your mental health lecture, which is the benefits and the impact of omega-3. All right, so guys, this is what I'm saying, the discrepancy in the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. Right now, for instance, in today's time, what is recommended is a higher intake of omega-6 to omega-3, all right? So are the Australian findings and so are the US NRV findings, okay? So everywhere, if you see high amount of omega-6, if you see my cursor over here, versus omega-3, there are bunch of studies which are showing that we should minimize this ratio. It shouldn't be so big. So this is like practically say 8:1. Okay, the ratio is 8:1. This is 13:1 approximately, right? So over here they say that the ratio should not be so far apart because you have omega-6, which is essentially consumed so easily in the diet. Therefore, researchers are recommending that narrow this down. It should be, say, at least 2:1 or 5:1. But as I said that there is not sufficient level 1 evidence to make this into a dietary guideline. For it to become a national dietary guideline, which is benefiting majority of the normal healthy population, it needs to undergo rigorous amount of research. Okay. So that's why it is still not implemented as such. But yes, on a 1-to-1 level, say in a clinical setting, you may see benefits, okay, by say modulating the ratios of omega-6 to omega-3 for an individually catered patient case. All right, so yes, and of course it has shown benefits for cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, asthma. If you see, all of these conditions are again underlying inflammatory condition, and omega-3 has a big role as an anti-inflammatory agent, and therefore the logic sits well, okay, as to why they are recommending a narrower dose of omega-6 to omega-3, because omega-3 as an anti-inflammatory agent can support in management of these conditions. All right. Okay, so now you have your monounsaturated fats. So with monounsaturated fats, what has been seen, that as we saw it in the earlier slide, that yes, what the foundation has recommended, the Heart Foundation, is saturated fat should be replaced with say monounsaturated fats, okay, which will help you to lower your cholesterol, okay, so your total cholesterol and your LDL cholesterol. All right, so yes, so basically independent effect of monounsaturated fat, not as well established, but we have seen MUFAs is a big part in the Mediterranean diet, and Mediterranean diet holistically has shown wonderful effects on cardiac health. All right. And why? But remember, Mediterranean diet is not only MUFAs. Mediterranean diet is filled with fruits and veggies, meaning high antioxidative properties, high polyphenol properties, all right, a high fiber in their diet. So there are a lot of compounds which are working in integration to give you that benefit. Okay, we are only talking about MUFA in isolation. If everything else is crappy in your diet and only MUFA, it's not going to do a magic trick. Okay, so that's what I want to say. All right, so yes, now you have your nuts. So yes, nuts are recommended. On average, what is recommended is say 30 grams of nuts. And generally when in my clinical settings, when I ask my patients how much of nuts do you eat, they say generally it is said fistful. This is not a fist, guys. This is like a clawful. Okay, so this is a clawful is not the right serve size. This is a fistful. Okay, so only this much amount of nuts will become your 30 grams. All right. So basically when I ask them, they'll be like, I'm like, no, this is clawful. Okay, so you don't want to be holding nuts like this in your hand. All right. So yes, nuts, yes, they are high in fat, but remember nuts come from plant. Plant doesn't contain cholesterol. So what type of, say, fats are there in your nuts? They are going to be bound to be healthy fats, like predominantly your MUFAs and also your PUFAs. Okay, but predominantly it's your MUFAs. All right, so yes, and nuts, certainly it has lots of fiber as well, insoluble fiber, which in itself has good effect on heart health. We'll be talking about fiber next. And yes, it has shown to lower your LDL cholesterol. All right. And yes, certainly because it has fiber, it has shown to increase your insulin sensitivity, decrease your insulin resistance. All right. So yes, therefore nuts are beneficial with your heart health. Okay. Now with dietary cholesterol, every 10 years, I see that the recommendations of eggs keep changing. It's not that I'm 60 years and I'm being seeing this for 6 decades, but from the time I'm like aware, this keeps changing. But right now the recommendation is that yes, you may consume up to 6 eggs per week for a normal healthy individual. All right, and that would be fine. Okay, so basically the concern about egg is why? Because the yolk, as you know, is high biological value protein. Yes, it is, but it is also high in cholesterol. Okay, so that's why the concern is. But again, understand, guys, it is, as a dietitian, you have to look at diets holistically. It is just that, oh, I'll cut eggs from my diet, but it is basically if your diet is so high in, say, fried food, and say using this oil for n number of time in your frying, automatically increases your trans fat content. Okay, so all of those are going to be more of an issue long term in your cardiac health rather than having that one simple egg. Okay, that's why eggs are not to blame as such independently. Okay, so you have to look at the diet holistically. Of course, if you are having, say, there are some people who have very limited knowledge about nutrition, and they say that, oh, I have like 4 eggs, raw eggs in a day because I'm working out and I need to put that muscle mass. No, that's not the right way to go. Yes, you need to put in your protein, but eggs are not the only sources of protein. You need to balance out your cholesterol as well. Okay, so yes, that's a different thing when we talk about sports nutrition. But basically, yes, don't blame eggs. And eggs should be taken into consideration by looking at the overall picture. And as you know, dietary cholesterol doesn't only mean egg. Dietary cholesterol means animal fats, and that cholesterol comes from any sort of animal fats, particularly your red meat, your white meat with skin, and of course, your dairy fats as well. Okay. So yes, dietary cholesterol increases triglycerides. LDL is what is seen, but yes, not as much so as the bad effects which you have with saturated fats and trans fats. Okay, so those are much more worse, saturated fats and your trans fats. Okay, so yes, that's why I said look at this in a holistic picture rather than just blaming eggs or one thing. That's not the way to go. Okay, so in conclusion, in summary, what are the recommendation? You have your saturated fats, okay, which is less than 7% of total energy. Your trans fat, less than 1% of energy. Omega-6, 8 to 10%. Omega-3, where you have is 500 milligram per day, okay, which is your EPA and DHA, which is coming from your fatty fish. Or else if you're having alpha linolenic acid, your vegetarian source, then it's 2 gram. And dietary cholesterol over here, I have said 6 eggs per week. But again, remember, it needs to be taken holistically. All right, the consideration. All right, so what about total dietary fat? Very limited research to clearly point out that there is a direct intake between you eat so much fat and this is what the issue is. No, um, I had shown you in the obesity lecture where there was a study on low fat consumption, moderate fat consumption. It was the moderate fat consumption which had really good health benefits in terms of, say, managing your lipid profile and reducing your weight, so on and so forth. So it is not just about quantity, as long as it is, say, fitting in this range. Sorry, where did it go? Yeah, this range, it is all good. It is more about quality of fats. Where is the fat coming from? Okay, so that is more of an important question. Okay, so yes, now I'll talk about your phytosterols. You know how I said that why I'm not say discouraging people from having, say, olive oil sort of butter, olive oil butter or proactive and things. So basically, yes, olive oil butter and all of those, they are basically vegetable oils. Okay, so like olive oil, and then that is made into, say, a butter consistency. So yes, there is say a sort of a hydrogenation process involved, but it is now, as I said, the processes are very sophisticated. So you will always see the trans fat content in the label, which will help you to make an informed choice. Okay, so don't worry about that as such. You worry more about trans fats coming from your fried foods, oil being used 100 times in that frying, coming from, say, pure sources of margarine, and coming from really cheap confectionery item, because that is where they use a lot of cheap margarine. Okay, so yes, phytosterols, where you have, or stanols, they have their chemical structure is very similar to cholesterol, but humans, they do not absorb these phytosterols or stanols. Okay, so there is very minimal absorption to no absorption. Okay, and where do you find them? You predominantly find them in your vegetable oils. Okay, so all these oils which we use, and yes, small amounts in your nuts as such, and very, very minuscule amounts in your legumes, grains, and seeds. Not as such. Okay, but yes, as I said, your functional foods such as your soybean oil and things, so that will be having your phytosterol stanols. Predominantly in the food industry, in our food market, you have fortified products with phytosterols and stanols. Okay, so 2 to 3 grams per day of phytosterol enriched food is shown to decrease your LDL level. Okay, which is good. All right, and the FASAN's recommendation is 0.8 to 1 gram of phytosterol per serve. So what is that per serve? So say this 10 grams of margarine will have, say, approximately 1 gram of phytosterol. Okay, and then if you're having phytosterol enriched cereal, milk, etc., that all would add on to it. All right, and see, very, very important is that phytosterol, it reduces the absorption of beta carotene. Beta carotene is your vegetarian form of vitamin A. Okay, so your yellow, orange fruits and veggies, all of that, your vitamin A. Okay, so yes, in that sense, it's always good to have, say, one extra, say, one daily serve of fruit or veggie, which is high in beta carotene. And as a dietitian, what I would recommend is that have a gap between your phytosterol enriched food versus the fruit intake, or the say beta carotene enriched veggie intake which you're having. Okay, so basically say having proactive toast and then having say apple with it, uh, try avoiding that in say one meal which is your breakfast generally. Okay, why? Because have that fruit say in between your say your breakfast and your lunch, your brunch sort of a thing. Okay, because that will help you to aid the absorption of beta carotene from your apple rather than lose it to phytosterol. Okay, because that's the only thing which is phytosterol reduces the gut absorption of beta carotene, so we have to be mindful of that. But that's why phytosterols are good. That's why the encouragement now is to have say vegetable oil sourced butter rather than say normal butter. But the other hand, the argument is that dairy fats, they contain odd chain saturated fatty acids, and dairy fats are therefore good for heart. So there are a lot of school of thoughts, a lot of arguments. At the end, if you go to a dietitian, she will look at the diet holistically, and she will choose the path of moderation. Meaning, if you really love your butter on your toast, she won't ask you to change that to proactive if it is not something which you want to do, but she'll look at other strategies, which is what type of oil you're using, what type of say total fats you're having, what are the main other sources of fat you're having within this total fat, how much of fiber, many other strategies to make sure that you are having a holistic diet, which is say a preventative strategy for your say coronary heart disease or any other chronic conditions, if you say you're going as a healthy individual for like just a lifestyle management approach. So yes, so basically that is how means we dietitians work, which is looking at what options the patients want to keep versus what are the other things where we have to start negotiation. Okay. So yes, then you have the last one, which is your carbohydrate. So yes, lots of refined carbohydrate or lots of simple carbohydrate has shown to increase your triglycerides level. Okay, so you would generally say that for normal people like you and me who eat a generally balanced diet, meaning having food from all 5 food group, we won't be seeing a lot of this problem. But you know how you have these amazing people, sarcasm, okay? How you have these amazing people who go on a fruitarian diet, all right? And all they do is they just have fruits morning, afternoon, evening, night, and say maybe even midnight. And they do this for a couple of months to lose weight. Then what happens? You have, is it like normal for us, your Australian guidelines to healthy eating, they say that have 2 serves of fruit like normal healthy adult. What if you're having say 15 serves of fruit in a day, and if you're doing it for 3 months, obviously you will see an increase in triglyceride level, and now you know why. Okay, even if you're just having fruit, and fruit is what? Fructose. Fructose is a fruit sugar, and I had taught you how fructose can be a sweet poison. Okay, so even if you're not having fructose say as a refined say source such as cane sugar, but if you're having 15 serves of fruit for 3 months, and if you do a blood test and you're shocked that your triglyceride levels are increased, well, they need to take a nutrition class, because now you know why. Fructose, what will happen? It will promote lipogenesis, meaning endogenous production of VLDL. What will VLDL do? It will promote these production of your fat around your liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and of course you also have production of triglyceride. All right. So now you see how it is not good to have so much amount of say refined carbohydrate or even simple carbohydrate, or go on a fruitarian diet for your heart health. Okay, because you don't want dyslipidemia. All right. So yes, certainly within say carbohydrate, what is recommended is fiber, and how much of fiber is recommended is 6 grams of insoluble fiber. All right, which is say like around your 100 grams of whole grain bread. Okay, so for example, your 1 thick slice, all right, or 2 medium slices. All right, and then you have say 3 grams of soluble fiber, which is found in your oats, psyllium, husk, and all of your fruits. So the skin of your fruits. So don't remove the skin and eat. Why do we recommend? Is because the skin is the skin of the fruit is the one which has pectin, and pectin is your soluble fiber. Okay, so this fiber is definitely recommended for heart health. Why? Because with what it does is that your insoluble fibers will get fermented in your large intestine. One of the mechanisms is what I'm talking about. More mechanisms would have been explained to you in food science. So one of the main mechanisms is insoluble fiber. Yes, it gets fermented in the large intestine. It will produce your short chain saturated fatty acids like butyric acid, and butyric acid will help to increase your HDL and decrease your total cholesterol and LDL. Good thing. Okay, so soluble fiber, therefore, how it can be good for heart health. Of course, it has its impact on obesity because it is satiating. And what else? Yes, it has its impact on constipation conditions and those which I'll talk about in the GI lecture. Okay, so and with soluble fiber, basically it has a gelling effect. Okay, so yes, again, it has to do with satiation. Majority of the research with heart health is to do with insoluble fiber, butyric acid, and say the HDL, LDL. But soluble fiber in combination with insoluble fiber also helps to improve your heart health by increasing your HDL levels. Okay, so yep, guys. So basically, these are the main things which I wanted to cover in today's lecture. Today's lecture was pretty straightforward, I think. Well, I hope it was, and you felt the same. Okay, so, and guys, I just wanted to let you know that this is week 3, where you would be given the interface feedback. So please do complete the feedback and let me know what you like about these online lectures so I can continue doing them. And of course, we will be meeting face to face in the tutorials. Well, I'll have the opportunity to solve all of your doubts and queries around the lecture content as well, because we'll be practicing mechanisms. You would have got a hang of this by now, so that is good. All right, so rest assured, I look forward to your feedback, and yes, your good feedback encourages me to keep on doing the good work. All right, and any feedback which I feel I can improve and I can say take on board in this semester, I'll do that. If not, it is going to benefit your future cohort. Okay, but yes, because of COVID, we can't have face-to-face lectures, unfortunately. So that's just how the nature of things are. Okay, this year, 2020. All right. So yes, guys, your next lecture is on mental health. All right. So I'll see you in your next lecture, but I'll see you in the tutorials before that. Okay. So yes, see you soon. All right. This is just an extra information. Okay. Just an FYI, which I wanted to point out that atherosclerosis does not happen overnight. Okay. This is just to show you that. All right. And this is just a few more, say, DASH diet eating plans. Just an FYI for you. Okay, especially those who are planning to take nutrition and dietetics in the future. All right, guys. So yes, that's from my end, and I'll see you soon in the tutorials. I'll just stop this video properly. See you.